It's not like there are two particulars, you and the set of dragons, and then there's a thinking of relation that holds between them, or that you bear to it. Rather, there is just you, the only particular here. Thinking is a first order property that you have, and dragon-wise is the way in which, so it's dragon-wise is a second order property that you have. It's a property of the thinking. And more generally, I suggest perception, thinking, desiring, all the different kinds of intentional acts that you could have. Let's just summarize them with the term represent. Maybe not the most felicitous term, but we'll just use that. You represent dragons in general will be paraphrased into you represent dragon-wise. That's the adverbial theory. I'm not going to endorse this kind of theory, but I'll endorse a variation on it. Now, the question that arises immediately is, what does it mean to represent dragon-wise? I understand what it means to represent a dragon. I understand what it means to represent Luca. But what is it to represent Luca-wise? That's less obvious. So there are different variations on this, I think. One view you could have is inferentialist adverbialism. X represents dragon-wise if and only if X has a dragonesque inferential role. I should say maybe that X here ranges over states, representational states, not over creatures that can have representational states. So we can say both that thinkers represent dragon-wise, and that thoughts represent dragon-wise. But it's more natural to say that thinkers represent a certain way because they have thoughts that represent a certain way. So the thoughts are the more basic kind of representation. So that's the kind of thing that X ranges over. X represents dragon-wise if and only if X has a dragonesque inferential role. There's a kind of inferential role, and particular inferential role that you can specify, which we can call the dragonesque inferential role. And when you have that, then an item represents dragon-wise. Now this view, I think this is basically the kind of inferentialism you get in Brandom. An inferentialist theory of representation tells you that representation is not a matter of a relation to the world, it's a matter of the inferential role within the system of representations. So inasmuch as it says it's not a relation to the world, it's an adverbialist view. And the way that it unpacks the adverbial locution suggests this. Now, I think there is one very grave problem with this. This is not my own invention. A lot of people have discussed this. David Lewis discusses this as a problem for global descriptivism, and some cognitive scientists discuss it as a problem for functional role semantics or conceptual role semantics. It's what they call, at least, the grounding problem, the cognitive scientists. You have a web of items, and they get their representational character, or they fall under the intentional types that they do, in virtue of their relations to either items within the web. But in order for the representational character or the intentional type to be fixed, you really need that these other items will already have their representational character or intentional type fixed. Otherwise, you have a whole web of items waiting to get their intentional type fixed by having these other states that items that they're related to fixed. And if you have a web where it's all kind of in a state of waiting, you could also have permutations that will not perturb the inferential role, but will perturb the representational character or the intentional type. Was that clear? I have a feeling that this was not clear. Maybe, how about this? You have a web of items. You need some items to fix their intentionality first, which intentional acts they are, before you can define the intentionality of other items in relation to them. Because if every item is getting its representational character or its intentional type fixed by relation to other items, then the whole web is never getting anything fixed. That wasn't much better, but I'll move ahead. Phenomenological adverbialism says that to represent dragon-wise is to have a dragonesque phenomenal character. Here, phenomenal character, I should say, is there are two notions of phenomenal character out there, I think. One is the notion of a sensuous quality, red, bitter, loud. These are phenomenal characters. Then there's another more flexible notion of phenomenal character is whatever we have an explanatory gap with, whatever produces an impression of an explanatory gap. So we could define phenomenal character as the property F such that in the actual world there appears to be an explanatory gap between F and physical reality. This would be the rigidified definite description that fixes the reference of phenomenal. So it's this more flexible notion of phenomenal character that I'm using, and in that more flexible notion there will be thoughts will probably have phenomenal character. So when you think dragon-wise, the claim here, it's because your thought has a phenomenal character, a draconesque phenomenal character. Here you still have a generalizing problem in the sense that a lot of representations just don't have phenomenal characters. Someone might have a tacit belief that 12.37 is greater than 8.92, and that's not going to have a phenomenal character. And linguistic representations certainly don't have phenomenal character. The word cat doesn't have a phenomenal. There's nothing it's like to be the word cat. What I suggest we do to overcome these kinds of problems with these versions of adverbialism is that we develop a variant on adverbialism which divides intentionality into two subgroups. There will be intentional states that are more basic, and they will get their intentionality either inferentially or phenomenologically. And then there will be other intentional acts that get their intentionality in relation to those first intentional acts. So the way I'm thinking of this is that we should distinguish between derived and underived intentionality and say that only underived intentionality is adverbial and derived intentionality just derives from underived intentionality. So that's the idea. Underived intentionality is adverbial or non-relational, and derived intentionality derives from underived intentionality. So what's derived intentionality? Well, we all know that some things have their intentionality in and of themselves, and other things have it just due to convention or because we decide to give them a certain intentionality. A stop sign can mean stop, but it can also mean go, or it can mean you have just entered New York City. It can mean anything you want it to mean. But a thought about a cat means cats. Doesn't matter what you want to use it for. That's what it means. So words and stop signs don't have their intentionality in and of themselves, whereas thoughts and experiences do have their intentionality in and of themselves. Will that help? It depends on how this all works out, but the general shape of the solution then, of the position, will be something like this. Underived dragon representations are dragon representations not in virtue of bearing their representation in relation to dragons, but in virtue of instantiating the non-relational property of representing dragon-wise. That's underived dragon representations. Derived dragon representations are dragon representations not in virtue of bearing the representation in relation to dragons, but in virtue of bearing the derivation relation to underived dragon representations. So in both cases, dragon representations are not the kind of representations they are in virtue of bearing a relation to dragons. Rather, there's something else happening. With the kind of basic representations, they will be adverbial. They are the representations they are in virtue of that adverbial property they have. With the underived representations, it will be because they derive from the underived ones. This is the general shape of the solution. How will this help with inferentialist adverbialism? I actually think